Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Scott Clowney, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs. Thanks so much for joining us. Tonight's program is part of Architecture Everywhere, a monthly series organized by the Washington Architectural Foundation, exploring how architecture comes to life in unexpected ways through other arts and humanities disciplines. For this presentation, we welcome Richard Guy Wilson, Commonwealth Professor Emeritus in Architectural History from the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia. He is a frequent lecturer, television commentator, and author of many articles and books on different aspects of American and modern architecture and design. Tonight, Richard will talk about architecture and Edith Wharton's novels, specifically The House of Mirth and Summer, as well as her other writings, including The Decoration of Houses and Italian Villas and Their Gardens. Before we begin, a note regarding your participation tonight. By participating in this webinar, you are granting your permission to be recorded and for the recording to be distributed as AIADC and the Washington Architectural Foundation may choose. If you have any questions or comments during the program, please use the Q&A or chat features and we'll follow up with those afterwards. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker, Richard Guy Wilson. Richard, thanks for being with us. Richard, don't forget to unmute yourself.
Oh, there I am. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Good, okay. So we're here. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and very pleased to be here. So let me start off with Charity Royal stopped at a weak hinge gate. Passing through it, she walked down a brick path to a queer little brick temple with white wooden columns supporting the pediment. Suddenly the door opened and a young man had entered the library. "Have you a card catalog?" he asked, and in a pleasant, abrupt voice. And the oddness of the question caused her to drop her work. "A what?" "I mean, I can't see you have any books on the old houses about here. I suppose for that matter, this part of the country hasn't been much explored. They all go on doing Plymouth and Salem. So stupid. This place must have had a past. It must have been more of a place once." He stopped short, and with the blush of a shy man who overhears himself and fears he has been voluble. "I'm an architect, you see, and I'm hunting up old houses in these parts." This is from Edith Wharton's Summer, and the building on the left is the Lenox Library, where Edith Wharton volunteered for a number of years, and I'm just showing you an example of an old building on the right. The Sprague's rooms were known as the Louis Suite, and the room walls above the wainscoting of highly varnished mahogany were hung with salmon pink damask and adorned with over-portraits of Marie Antoinette and a princess. Undine Sprague looked out of the window through the many layers of ace at Fifth Avenue, which is where she wanted to be. Lily Bart at Bellamont, feeling no desire for self-communion, which had awaited her in her room, she lingered on the broad stairway, looking down into the hall below, where the last card players were grouped about a tray of tall glasses. The hall was arcaded, with a gallery supported in columns, of pale yellow marble. Tall clumps of flowering plants were grouped on the walls. This gave Lily a sharper edge to the meagerness of her own opportunities. Seating herself on the upper steps of the terrace, Lily leaned her head against the honeysuckles, wreathing the balustrade. The fragrance of the late blooms seemed an emanation of the tranquil scene, a landscape tutored to the last degree of rural elegance. In the foreground glowed the warm tints of the gardens. Beyond the lawn, with the maples and velvety firs, one could see off in the distance. It represented a future that she had chosen. I should note that that last scene, and what you're looking at right here, is from Edith Wharton's house, The Mount, which she built, and where she would normally in the mornings, sitting in bed, would write on her novel for that day. And the descriptions, in many cases here, especially for the House of Mirth, which was written at her house, The Mount, some of the scenes directly come from that. And I'm showing you on the left just as simply a page from a manuscript. Later it would be given to somebody who would come in and type it up for her, but it is in her collection at Yale University. Halosphere was involved in a slightly romantic encounter. And as she says, and I quote, "I perceive that you're not familiar with the epic-making work of A.J. Downing, Esquire, on landscape gardening in America." She turned to the bookcases, ran her hand along the shelf, and took down a volume bound in old leather. What I'm showing you here, this is one of Edith's very last novels. She had actually, by this point in time, lived in France for about 20 years. But she, as you just heard, she recommends A.J. Downing's treatise on landscape gardening, originally published in 1941, and that I'm showing you the frontispiece and the title page on the right. And then if you look very closely at the very little image that is on the cover of Hudson River bracketed, you'll see that that's very much a Downing house. What is really rather amazing about this is who knew who A.J. Downing was in 1928, 1929. He had been totally forgotten. Yes, he appeared the year before in 2 mentions in a book by Fisk Kimball on American architecture, but that was about it. What all of this shows is the tremendous interest that Edith Wharton had in architecture and the decorative arts. Character and scenic detail are in fact one to the novelist who has fully assimilated his material. The impression produced by a landscape, a street, or a house should always be to the novelist, be an event in the history of the soul. And this comes from her book, book Writing and Fiction. Edith Wharton, of course, is well known, I think, to many of us as one of the great American writers, not just simply a female writer, but one of the great American writers, widely hailed in her time, and really hasn't disappeared. Seems to be coming back all the time, coming back all the time. But what I'm emphasizing in this is this tremendous interest that she had in architecture and the decorative arts, which has not been really paid a lot of attention to by a lot of scholars. Now, as you know, that she did write many, many different books and so forth. And what I want to do is just go through a little bit of her background here. She was born Edith Newbold Jones. Her family was an old New York family of old wealth, not the new wealth of, say, the Morgans or the Vanderbilts, sort of old wealth. And she grew up in New York. She was actually baptized in Grace Church, which I'm showing you on the right, which was considered at that time to be the really elite church for the wealthy, in New York. She spent her youth both in New York. Her father had and her mother had some money, not enough money, but a considerable amount of money that they could travel, and she also spent time abroad. The type of house that she grew up in is on the right, and she later characterized this as a hideous brown stain that spread over New York. On the left is a photograph of her parents' sitting room. And keep this in mind because this is exactly what she rebelled against, this overdone sort of interior, and etc. And I should note that she had a upbringing. She was basically privately tutored. She didn't go to school or anything like that, but private tutors. Her relationship with her parents was complex, but one can say that she didn't really get along with her mother that well. And indeed, she characterized her mother in her memoir as a born shopper, whereas her father, she was very closely connected with. And in her memoir, she remarks upon discovering in her father's library these books right here. John Ruskin, that's a frontispiece from the Stones of Venice, but some of the Ruskin's other books. And then James Ferguson's book, A Handbook of Architecture. And she mentions these in her autobiography, which says something about just simply the importance and so forth that this would be to her. Her family also had a house in Newport, Rhode Island, which had become the elite summer colony for the elite Americans, but especially for the wealthy New Yorkers. You did not yet have the gigantic mansions, so you had pretty big houses, and this was her parents' house that was right here, and where she would spend part of the summer. And she remembers very fondly taking the carriages and running out through the and going out to the countryside. But also they did spend time abroad. And indeed, while she was growing up, her father had some financial difficulties, and it was cheaper in some cases for Americans who live abroad in Paris. And so she spent portions of her youth abroad especially in Paris, but also traveling. And she did, as she grew up, made connections with a number of different individuals. Bernard Berenson, a Boston boy, who would become the major figure in the discovery of Italian Renaissance art from an American perspective. And Berenson wrote a number of books, and Edith is very closely connected to him. Another person that she met abroad is Vernon Lee. This is a portrait of Vernon Lee by John Singer Sargent. And Vernon Lee was English, but she was also very involved in the arts and wrote a very important book, but was very closely connected with Edith, and actually edited some of Edith's very earliest works. The point here is that she has this sort of international type of connection. She marries Edward, known as Teddy Wharton, in 1881. And Wharton came from an old Boston family. He supposedly had a lot of money. It turned out he really didn't have quite as much money. And indeed, and the irony of all of this is that Edith actually inherits a considerable amount of money and has a lot more money than Teddy ever does. Their relationship is very, very complex, and one has to be careful about this because there's lots of speculation about their marriage, and I won't go into all of that and so forth. And Teddy, in time, begins to develop a sort of manic type of depression, and ultimately they really do have to separate and ultimately do get divorced. But it is very interesting that when he does pass away, and by this point they had been divorced for a considerable number of years, Edith writes very fondly about him and says that she really always loved him. But anyway, I'm showing you here, they always love little dogs, as you can see in these photographs. But also it's interesting to look at the headdress on Edith. She is the woman in the very right in the right photograph. In 1891, a few years after they're married, but Edith is beginning to get an awful lot of money. She actually purchases a house in Newport known as Land's End. And it was a house that was built in the 1870s by John Hubbard Sturgis and is in one of the farmost points of land on the island where Newport is located, known as Aquidneck Island, and had a tremendous view, as you can see right here, out to the ocean. It was very much of a, what we would call today, a Victorian type of a house. But they purchased this house, and Edith sets about remodeling it. Now, it is about this point in time that she purchased the house in 1891 that she meets the young man that is down on the left, named Ogden Codman Jr. And Ogden Codman Jr. was also an old Boston family that supposedly had money, though he never had all the money he wanted, and was constantly trying to marry somebody who would have money. He finally did marry a lady quite a bit older than him, and then she very conveniently died, so he got the money. But they do set about remodeling this house, I'm showing you here, the house has been much changed over the years. It's been stuccoed over in the exterior, some of the additions, but on the upper right, this is the way that the house looked. But Codman does some of the interior remodelings, and they become very close. Codman he does design a couple of houses, but basically he's what we might call an interior designer. And he does these tremendous renderings. He had actually studied at MIT, only lasted 1 year there. Then he was off to Paris, where he learned this. And he comes back and begins to do fancy people's houses and so forth. And this is a rendering that he did. And what is very interesting is that there is a whole series of letters between Edith and Ogden Codman about different sorts of things. For instance, this is a letter here written on Saturday, I think 1895, but I'm not quite sure when, in which she says, and I quote, "Couldn't you knock together, at least in pencil, one side of another drawing room? Either something very cold a la Bramante with a frieze of garlands, fluted pilasters, pediments over doors and niches, or else a 17th century room." Another letter. "I think your morning room will suffer, underlined very much," this is all handwritten, I should say, "unless the draftsman can take off that dark red from the upper part of the panels and make them a uniform pale pink." And so it's an interesting sort of combination here. Teddy's involved in this, but it is very clear that it is pretty much Edith that is doing this. And the house is remodeled. And this is the way that the dining room looked. And of course, it's a little bit different than the exterior of the house. It was also worthwhile to note this is one of the first places in America in those years that the French toile type of patterns and so forth, as I'm showing you here on the left, is used. And it becomes very popular. But Codman and Edith are really very important in bringing this in. What the house, though, did have, and I'm showing you a comparison here. This is the entrance hall. Edith and Teddy's house on the left, and this is the entrance hall to her parents' house in Newport. And well, you can see the difference. And while Edith's house certainly has certain sorts of historical elements to it, still at the same time it's been cleaned up from all of the stuff and so forth that her parents would have their entrance hall. One result of this collaboration with Edith on the remodeling of Land's End is that she secures for him a couple of different commissions. And one of these commissions is that for the Vanderbilts, they were putting up this gigantic house, the Breakers, and she is able to secure, she has the connections, able to secure for him to become the designer for the upstairs bedroom, such as this is one of his renderings, one of the renderings there for the bedrooms. And as Ogden wrote to his mother in a letter, "Who do you suppose I have for a client? Teddy Wharton told me today that Mr. Cornelius Vanderbilt wants to see me at his office at 11:30 tomorrow to talk about his Newport house. And he wants me to depart. Just think, what a client. The richest and nicest of them all. I'm going to thank Mrs. Wharton who brought this about." So she has these types of connections, which are very, very, very important. Just as another footnote to Land's End, that one of her cousins is Beatrix Ferran Jones, who goes on to a major career as a landscape designer and so forth. But her very first job is doing the gardens and the trellis work and so forth, as you see here at this end. Here's a drawing down below and the trellis work at Land's End. While all of this is going on, Edith is always writing. She's doing poems and she's doing articles, which are published in different people, but in particular in Scribner's Magazine. And this becomes very, very important. And these are short pieces. Some of them are results, as the Tuscan Shrine from the different trips taken abroad. Then there's poems and so forth, so forth is done. But one of the results of this is that she suggests to Ogden Codman, why don't we do a book on interior decoration? And unbelievably, Charles Scribner's and Sons picks it up. Now, the reason why they pick it up is because they thought that she had talent as a writer and that they might be able to get, which they would get, a lot of different novels out of it. But anyway, the decoration of houses is put together in 1896-97. This is the original cover, which doesn't look much like it. It's much more sort of an Art Nouveau type of cover. But if you look at the title page here, and this is very revealing, because Codman would later on say, well, I really wrote the book. Edith just sort of wrote down my ideas. Well, okay. But when you see the names of the authors lined up with a W before a C, in other words, Wharton before Codman, it shows that who is really responsible for it. And this is not to say that the book doesn't have some of Codman's ideas and so forth, but still at the same time, it is very much Edith that puts it together. Now, I should note that a reviewer of the manuscript, while it was still in manuscript form, she sends it to the man on the right, Charles Follen McKim of the great firm of McKim, Mead and White, which were the most major architectural firm in the country, well, New York based, but in the country at the time. And he was a close friend of Edith's. And he went through the manuscript, made a few suggestions, but said, this is brilliant. Go ahead and get the thing published. And so anyway, the book is published. But again, this shows her connections she is into the architectural scene. The illustrations in there of the photographs, basically photographs, she really didn't care for too much, but they really had a problem trying to find them. But what is interesting about the book, and it is, I think, still today, one of the major books on American interior decoration, is that while there are these views of house in Mantua and so forth, or the Royal Palace in Mantua, so if you look at the table of contents, you can see the way that this is done, that the historical decoration, then rooms, but then walls, doors, windows, fireplaces, ceilings. In other words, it breaks it down into the different parts and so forth, and how it ought to be put together. And as I say, the illustrations, she was never really that happy with some of them, and I should say that some of these she did acquire while abroad, but also Scribner's really said you really got to have these. You've really got to have these. You've really got to have these. You've got to have these fancy sort of illustrations. In the introduction, Edith and Ogden write, and this is the first line: rooms may be decorated in two ways. By a superficial application of ornament, totally independent of structure, or by means of those architectural features that are part of the organism of every house, inside as well as out. In other words, that the building really ought to be a total integral unit. Illustrations in it. Here are two. The upper right was the architecture, or excuse me, the furniture of the time of brigandage, when you used to pull your furniture around from castle to castle. In other words, medieval types of furniture. The type of furniture that she liked, of course, would be this Louis XV type of chair on the left. I'm just showing you this comparison here because down below, this is a Frank Lloyd Wright chair from a few years later, but that Wright is taking his image and so forth off of this, and that she is certainly not part of this. She's certainly not part of the modern movement going on at the time. They call upon all acknowledgement of all students of sociology that the instinct for symmetry is most strongly developed in those races which reach the highest artistic civilization. What they reject is the Victorian furniture that we see here. This type of thing, the overdone. No, they want to go back to furniture that is held together, furniture that's held together as a unit. So as I say, the illustrations that are, and this book has been republished a couple of different times, and I have to admit that I've done introductions to it and so forth. But the illustrations are very revealing of the taste of the time because, of course, the type of people they're talking to, but still at the same time, there is an underlying element here, which is very, very important. Back to Newport. She and Teddy lived in Newport. The book was published in 1897, and they lived there to 1901. But she becomes a little upset with what she is seeing is going on in Newport. That it isn't just the Cornelius Vanderbilt with the breakers, but here's Marble House by W.K. Vanderbilt. And in a letter to Codman, she writes, and I quote, this is May 1st, 1897. This is Edith writing to Ogden Codman. I quote, I wish the Vanderbilts didn't retard culture so very thoroughly. They are entrenched in a sort of thermopylae of bad taste from which apparently no force on earth can dislodge them. So she becomes very disenchanted and so forth with Newport. And so she and Teddy decide to move on. Now, let me just say here as a footnote to this, that Teddy begins to develop a certain sort of manic types of elements. And so while they do move up to the Berkshires in western Massachusetts, into the town of Lenox, still Teddy becomes more and more slightly disarranged and so forth, until finally in 1909, she leaves him and then ultimately they get divorced. But what she finds up in the Berkshires and in Lenox is another type of architecture. There is, yes, the Victorian, as such as this house in the upper right, but then there's this older architecture, which I already quoted a little bit from New Year's Day a few minutes ago. Or on the left, this is the Church in the Hill. And if you've ever read perhaps one of Edith's most popular novellas, Ethan Frome, this is the big hill that they go. This is the big hill that they go down. So what happens is that they purchase 100, Edith, basically, it's her money. Teddy is only getting $2,000 a year out of a fund, that she purchases 113 acres of land, and they set about designing and building a house here. Initially, she asks Codman to do it, but it doesn't work out too well and so forth. And so ultimately he leaves the job, and a young New York firm by the name of Hoppen and Cohn take over and design the house with very much Edith's fingers into the pie at all sides. Hoppen and Cohn had both worked in the McKim, Mead and White office. Now the question might come up, well, why didn't she ask Charles McKim to do it? And I don't know. However, I should note that by this point in time, 1901, McKim, Mead, and White were really doing of houses, just really very, very expensive houses. And while this came in at about 125,000, and today would be worth a lot more, so this is not the type of work they're doing, but they probably said, go to our friend Frank Hoppen of Hoppen and Cohn and have him do it. So the house is located on a hillside. And as you can see on the right, this is the entrance front, and then the garden side and the other side. So it's located in the hillside. It's a rather complex type of a plan here. This is the basement or the ground floor plan where you come in here. All of this is underground and so forth here. This is the service wing over here. But you come in here and then you go up the staircase, and then this is the main floor with a hall going across here. And then the main rooms, the main sitting room, the dining room here, library is located over here, stretched around, and again the service quarters over here. And it is the house has gone through. They left the house. It was sold in 1909. Went through many different things. It's actually a girls' school for a number of years, but was purchased a number of years ago, and there's been a huge restoration going on, taking it back to the time of the Wharton's occupancy. And so you're seeing here, this is the entrance hall in the upper left, and this staircase going up, and then this is a cross-axial hall leading across upstairs. Codman did come back in, and he did do a couple of interior elevations. They do bring him back in, and there is a portion of the interior that certainly certainly his. The restoration is still going on over the years. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I just really do suggest that if you can, that you might go and take a look at this house. This is the library, which is the holiest of the holies, and where she spends a great deal of her time, here. This is the boudoir, and the house was worked out in a variety of different sorts of styles and so forth, on the interior. While she was there, and she'd always been infatuated with Italy. And there are a number of different letters over the years in her archives, and also up at the Codman archives up in Boston, about her describing Italy and so forth. And the air is virtually filled with art, that I'd rather no place else live than there. But one of the things is, and there's a couple of books she does do in Italy, but one of the important books is this book here, published in 1904, Italian Villas and Their Gardens, with a wonderful set of illustrations by Maxfield Parrish that become very, very popular. And as she writes, and I quote, the traveler returning from Italy with his eyes and imagination full of the ineffable Italian garden magic knows vaguely that the enchantment exists, that he's been under its spell, and is more potent, more enduring, more intoxicating to every sense than the most elaborate and glowing effects of modern horticulture. Is it because the sky is bluer, the vegetation is more luxuriant? Our midsummer skies are almost as deep, our foliage is as rich, and perhaps more varied. There are indeed not a few resemblances between North American summer climate and that of Italy in spring and summer. Some of those who have fallen under the spell are inclined to describe the Italian garden magic to the effect of time. But to seek the answer, one must go deeper. The garden must be studied in relation to the house, and both in relation to the landscape. And so, excuse me, it's a very, very important book, at that time. And what she had hoped to find, I should note, is that in America, while we didn't quite have the garden and so there, that maybe we could develop something there. That, you know, that in Edith, there is both the foreground and the background. She found Italy divided not into three parts, but into two: a foreground that one must understand before one can know the background. This she hoped to find in America and did not. For, as she writes, and I quote, The American landscape has no foreground, and the American mind has no background. So she was discouraged by what she saw. Here we are. This is another wonderful illustration of Villa Gambaraya. And then I'm just showing you the gardens that they did lay out at the Mount, which is on the right, with the houses up here, and then the first terrace, and then coming down the steps. It's very much like the Villa Gambaraya to here, and down once more. And then this wonderful cross-axial garden that stretches across here. And this is a place where a lot of different things went on. And there were parties that were held on the terraces, looking out into the garden, and people came to visit. And I'm just showing you one, but a person who she had met earlier, but becomes a very, very close friend, and certainly is one of her guides in some of her literature and so forth. But there it is. There it is. This is Edith in the back seat. This is Teddy up here in the front. This is the driver, and this is Henry James back there. And Henry James comes a number of times. To visit. But as I said already, Teddy is becoming increasingly depressed and so forth, and problems erupt. He becomes violent at times and so forth, and finally it just has to be a separation. Just a couple more shots. This is for one of their puppies, or one of their dogs that died. This is the stables, and this is the small cemetery for the dogs. So the upshot of this is that she leaves in 1909 and takes off to France. She lives at times in Paris. She also buys a big villa outside of Paris, which we see here on the right, which is the Pavilion Colombe. But she continues to write. During World War I, she is very, very involved in helping out the wounded soldiers and so forth, and gets a big medal for that. But she continues. She continues to write. And I will just wind up here with two quotations. This is from New Year's Day. And she says, and I quote on New Year's Day, "The most perilous coquetry may be not in a woman's way of arranging her dress, but in her way of arranging her drawing room. And in this art, Mrs. Hazeldine excelled." What is there in the atmosphere of such houses that makes them so enchanting? Why is it that those women, as the others call them, alone know how to put the awkward at ease, check the familiar, smile a little? The difference of the atmosphere is felt on the very threshold. The flowers grow differently in their vases. The lamps and easy chairs have found a clever way of coming together. The books on the table, the very ones the one is longing to get hold of. And so I'm just showing you two views here. This is of the library, and then here on the right is of the dining room. But how important all of this is. Much, much earlier in the fullness of life, she writes the following: "But I have sometimes thought the woman's nature is like that of a great house full of rooms. There is the hall, through which everyone passes in going in and out. The drawing room, where one receives formal visits. The sitting room, where the members of the family come and go as they please. But beyond that, far beyond, are the other rooms, the handles of whose doors perhaps are never turned. No one knows the way to them. No one knows whether they lead. And the innermost room, the holy of the holies, the soul sits alone and waits for a footstep that never comes." Thank you very much. And if there are any questions,
yes, thank you so much. For everyone in the audience, please send us your questions. use the Q&A feature. Or any comments you have, please use the chat. I will mention this one. Sally, thanks for chiming in the chat earlier. This goes back to, I think that you were talking about the covers of a book. It says Wharton's name may have been before Codman's name on the title page because the publishers thought that her name would sell more books. So
well,
comment there.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, again, this is, I mean, I'm out there on a diving board jumping up and down and so forth, or a trampoline. But it is, I mean, a number of the biographies and so forth have all said that one of the reasons why Scribner's picked this book up was because she had published stuff in Scribner's magazine and they saw a promise in her. And so there's that. The second thing is I can genuinely say that she wrote the damn thing. Yeah, there's Codman's ideas in there, but she's the person that wrote the entire damn thing. And as I mentioned, there is Charles McKim's involvement in doing the manuscript. And many, many, many years ago, when I was doing my PhD dissertation on Charles McKim and the American Renaissance, this is back in the early 1970s, I was doing research. A lot of McKim's papers are at the Library of Congress, and they have these big books of copies of letters, typewritten letters that the office would do, and there would be this copy. And I came across, in paging through this thing, I came across this thing written up in the upper corner, to E.W. And then there's this page and another page. What the heck is this all about? It says page woo, page 3, page 10, so forth. Okay, well, you might change this and so forth. And I had no idea what the heck this damn thing was. It took me a little while, but all of a sudden, ding dong, hey, wait a minute, maybe that's Edith Wharton. And so then I hunted around, and yes, by gosh, they had corresponded and so forth. And so, and that the letter does turn up, in the Edith Wharton archive. So she writes to McKim and says, will you please do this? Which I think tends to show that there is this, that she's the honcho in this. I'm not trying to say that there aren't Codman's ideas in there and so forth, but she's the person who really puts the whole thing together.
So how did your interest in Wharton begin, Richard?
Well, that's one reason right there, but there was another reason, and that is when I first started my graduate study at the University of Michigan, and unbelievably, I was studying library science at that point in time. I hadn't discovered really what I was doing. I just gotten out of the Navy after 3.5 years. You can imagine where I was in the 1960s in the Navy on a destroyer. But I took a course at the University of Michigan by a professor who became my PhD advisor. His name was Leonard Eaton, and the title of the course was American Architecture and Literature in the late 19th century. It was basically a focus on Chicago, but he had us read The House of Mirth. And I read The House of Mirth, and that was it. And so I went on, and I have not read everything. It was just the other day, or very, very recently, I think I saw that it's discovered that she actually wrote a play at one time that they've just rediscovered and so forth. But there's a tremendous amount of stuff that she wrote, and that's what really got me going. And then seeing this connection with McKim, and well, you know, onwards.
Excellent. So where do you see her influence most in today's design, specifically with female designers in architecture, interiors, fashion, etc.?
Well, that's hard to say because, as you may know, designers hate to read books. They like to write books, but the read books is another question. And of course, the background in the decoration houses, it's a very classical type of a thing. I mean, this, after all, this is the time when the so-called Beaux-Arts, the French school of architecture, where all of these Americans were floating off to and going to school over there, and very influencing the American schools of architecture. It was a very much of a classical type of approach. But still, if you do read the book and try and ignore the illustrations, you can begin to see that there are certain principles that are in there about the way that the interior ought to be in relationship to the exterior of the house, that it should not be two separate sorts of entities, and that you need to look at the different spaces, you need to look at the parts of the different spaces and so forth. It isn't just one humongous whole.
How many of our former properties are open to the public? You mentioned visiting Lennox, but are there other opportunities for people to visit?
That's the only, I hope I'm right on this here. The house in Newport is not open to the public. It's privately owned, and, well, don't go invade it. I mean, I get in there, but I mean, not. And there was another house that they lived in, that she and Teddy lived in, which is gone. And the parents' house, that's also gone. There are plaques different places. For instance, in Paris, there's a plaque on the building where she lived there, and Pavillon Colombe outside is there, but they're not open to the public and so forth.
Okay. We have someone that's interested in the boarding houses in the House of Mirth. When and why did they disappear in New York City?
Why did they disappear? I'm sorry, say that again. The boarding houses.
So boarding houses in the House of Mirth, when and why did they disappear in New York City?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. They went out of fashion in the 1920s. And it was just simply that there was a lot of questions about the morality and so forth of using those sorts of things and that type of thing. And so they really went out in the 1920s. Yeah.
Let's see. I think we answered this. So her original house is still in Rhode Island, correct? I think you mentioned that.
The house that...
But it's not available to see.
I mean, they didn't build it. It was built back in the 1870s. They remodeled it in the 1890s, and it is still there, though much changed on the exterior. It's been stuccoed over rather than it was wood. A couple of the additions have been additions put on and additions taken off and that sort of thing, but you still can get a sense. And she talks very poignantly in a couple of letters about the tremendous view out to the ocean and so forth from the house, and it is one of the most dramatic sights. I mean, Newport's got plenty of dramatic sights, but this is one of the most dramatic sights.
All right, we got some more questions coming in. Do you suppose Edith Wharton and Henry James discussed architecture? His writings are rich in descriptions of architecture.
I think that they did. Yes, very, very definitely. I mean, of course, Edith is sometimes seen as a disciple of Henry James. However, I don't think that they're, yes, there's connections and so forth. They certainly did discuss things. And she visited him. I mean, you know, James lived in Paris, basically, later on, well, England and Paris and England, and she certainly visited him there and so forth, and they would tootle around and do things. And I mean, I'm a Henry James fan too, but James's later works, a lot of the physical description tends to disappear to some degree. His earlier works, they're very filled with physical descriptions and so forth, but his later works, they tend to disappear to some degree.
Okay. Somebody says that J.K. Rowling also writes in great architectural detail. Are there other contemporary authors who fall into the Wharton category with regard to level of architectural detail?
Yes, I think there are, and I'm sorry, I just couldn't discuss every damn thing here and so forth, but Rawlings would certainly be one. Another person is Sinclair Lewis, Main Street and so forth. And indeed, when Sinclair Lewis, Edith did get the Pulitzer Prize, but she never got the Nobel Prize. But when Sinclair Lewis got this Nobel Prize, I think it's 1926 or 27, I think I'm right there about that. He did supposedly say Edith Wharton ought to be here instead of me. That there's a very close, I think, type of connection that is going on there between that. William Dean Howells, who was a very close friend of Edith's and a mentor in many ways, and an editor of, The Atlantic, yeah, I think, also has an awful lot of architectural description and so forth in his novels. And well, I'll have to think here a minute, but there are more. There are more.
Okay, a few more questions here. I think you mentioned that she wasn't too keen on Victorian aesthetic. So this question asks, do you have any idea what she thought of other architectural trends during her time? For example, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, Frank Lloyd Wright, or Chicago architects specifically like Sullivan and Root?
I've tried to ask her a couple of different times, but I can't get an answer out of her about this. There is no, she is fundamentally a classicist. The idea of symmetry, idea of order, and so forth, that she's fundamentally that. And the belief that you ought to know, the rules and so forth, and all of this. And as far as I know, there's no mention of William Morris, the Arts and Crafts Movement, of FLW out there in Chicago, who is becoming very well known by 1909, 1910, when she takes off. I mean, and after all, there's the big books of his, the two books, well, the big folio and the smaller book of his, which is published over there in Germany. But I don't know of any mention, anything like that. And Art Nouveau, I don't know. Again, as I say, it is to me always extremely interesting that the cover there, the original cover of that decoration of houses, is sort of Art Nouveau type of thing. But I just don't know of anything that is said about that.
Okay. So let's see, we have, what was Edith Wharton's opinion about the architecture and layout of New York City and Boston?
Of New York City and Boston? I think that she liked New York's order a lot better than Boston's disorder. But she would have liked very, very much, I think, the Back Bay area, Commonwealth Avenue, and all of that. And she certainly knew. She certainly knew that. And I mean, that was they begin the Back Bay right about the time that she's born, but really some of the major developments there take place as she's growing up, and so she would know that. What she does tend to like in New York, and she mentions this very frequently, are the parks. And some things are, I couldn't go into this, but Washington Square is mentioned, Madison Square is mentioned, the view from houses over to Central Park and so forth. That she likes the open spaces and so forth about this.
Okay, and let's see. Going back to the presentation summary, do you, so you stated for Wharton, buildings are not just backdrop, but actors. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this, the buildings that she talks about in her writings.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things I was a little concerned about what I was supposed to do in this damn talk and so forth here. And I mean, should I be approaching this? I'm not a literary scholar, though I've played with that and so forth. I mean, I'm more of an architectural historian and etc. But how should this architecture be seen as part of the bigger picture? And of course, if you're writing fiction, it's got to happen somewhere. I mean, it's got to be located somewhere, but sometimes it's pretty hard to figure out exactly what it is that you're, where it is that you're located, and are you just floating around in somebody's mind or something like that, or is there the actual physical, or is there actual physical? And I think that one of the things is that really does stand out so very strongly with Edith Wharton is the importance of the setting, that the architecture, the setting is part of it. And I mean, you can't, well, you gotta be careful here, but I mean, excuse me, practically every page and at the beginning of many of her chapters and so forth, it starts off with, well, this is where this is happening, or at least you get some sort of a physical description of this. And I think that she sees, as she says, that where we are is part of us. We are not just this totally floating around and so forth, that we are located in a specific spot, and that architecture, the interiors, the books that are falling off the shelf behind me and so forth, no, but that we are part of, this is part of our setting and so forth, and that how we create our rooms, where do we try to organize them, or it's just a pile? But no, but I mean, is a very, 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 very important part of a very, very important part of all of this. And it seems to me that what she does have is that she has this deeper psychological or physiological connection here that goes on. A psychological, physiological connection between here and out there.
Cool. So just to follow up on that, I think you mentioned earlier that she was tutored in terms of her education. And so where do you think she got this drive to be very ambitious and very, I don't know if strong-headed is the right word, but she's very firm in her belief in aesthetics and the way things should be? And was it partly a reaction against the generation before her, or was it just, part of being growing up in society in New York at the time? Or I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Well, that becomes difficult there. As I said, that there was a considerable tension always between her and her mother, whereas her father is very clearly the person. I mean, he unfortunately dies early, but very, very, a very, very important person. And as I mentioned, she does in her autobiography, she does mention her father's library, and she mentions Ruskin, and she mentions Ferguson. Now, I mean, she's talking about books that she saw 50, 60 years earlier, and that these made an impression on me and so forth. And so I think that is, I think that is part of it. And then, excuse me, again, one has to be a little careful on this, but it is clear that her parents, in their travels and so forth, she was seeing things from a different point of view than maybe other wealthy kids and so forth, that they were taking her to Europe. Other families are going to Europe too. As I mentioned, especially in the post-Civil War years, the economy sometimes could be fluctuating and so forth. And so sometimes it's a little easier to live abroad and so forth. But she was obviously seeing things and being introduced to stuff that was very, very important. And I don't know, it just, it happens.
All right, we got a few minutes left. Can you equate the construction of a good story to the sound design of a house? Good question from Susan Whistler.
Well, yes, I think that there is an organization of a story can be like an organization of a house, right? And it is there a path that you're going through, and etc. I mean, not that you know the path right away there at the beginning, but is there a path that is leading you through it, some sort of an order, or is there total disorder? And I think that you can make the equation that there is very much this connection with her, that as they say, she is a classicist in many ways in her taste and so forth in architecture and interior design, but still that there's this type of order, and that order I think you can see in her different writings and so forth. At the same time, I should say that she does go, I mean, for instance, one of the very last novels, which I mentioned just very, very briefly, was Hudson River Bracketed, which I find absolutely extraordinary that she's mentioning A.J. Downing, who was not known. I mean, he'd been totally forgotten and so forth. And here she is. I mean, she's got her hand in these things there and so forth. But this is written after she's been in Europe for 20 odd years and so forth. But also that the architecture she's talking about in there is more the mid-century, well, not more, it is. It's very much the mid-century type of architecture of Downing and H.A. Davis and so forth, this sort of rambling, picturesque type of thing. So she does have an appreciation, I think, for the different architecture and so forth.
Fantastic. It looks like we're out of time, so I'm going to have to end on that. I know we have a couple of other questions in there, but thank you so much for everyone joining us tonight. Special thanks to you, Richard, for your presentation. Really very eye-opening for me personally on Edith Wharton. I have an image behind me of the Mount, which I had the opportunity to visit. Gosh, I don't know, 15 years ago. So I remember it fairly well. It was a real joy to be
well,
there.
It is the work that's going on there.
It's all over now.
Anyway, that wasn't Edith Wharton. It was jumping in there. No, but anyway, no, but I do think really do go to the Mount. The work that's done there by Susan Whistler and the staff is really amazing.
Yeah, I recommend it too. So somebody asked earlier whether or not you're going to get a recording if you ended up coming in a little bit late. Absolutely. Everyone in the office or everyone that was registered for this, they're going to be able to see a recording of this. So so with that, thank you all so very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I just want to give a shout out to our next event in the series. It's coming up next month with Dr. Henrietta Rahusin. She's from the Department of Northern European Paintings at the National Gallery of Art. In that program on April 29th, Rahusin will present Architecture in Dutch Art. So you can register for this and other Architecture Everywhere programs at aiadc.com. And this concludes our presentation for the evening. So thanks again for joining us and take care, everyone.
Bye.
How many did you have, sweetie?
Oh, gee, I don't know. Well, I didn't look down there to see.
Did you say 60 something?
Yeah,
Huh?
yeah.